And we'll be talking more about horse race journalism with the media chapter. Next thing to bear in mind is image. It's good to look presidential, simply put. The best example of this is going to be the Kennedy-Nixon debate for the 1960 presidential contest. The story goes something like this, that presidential debates have been going on for a while. The 1960 debate is the first one that's going to be on TV. And not everybody in America in 1960 had a TV, so you have a sizable portion of individuals who have TVs and those that don't. So you've got a difference in perception based upon how someone watched or listened to the debate. The people who listened to the debate on radio thought that Nixon did a better job. The people that watched the debate on TV thought that Kennedy did a better job. The thought process is that Kennedy looked better than Nixon for numerous reasons. Number one, well, he's a Kennedy and Nixon's Richard Nixon. Nixon was sick. He had 5 o'clock shadow. Kennedy took a nap. Kennedy did the stage makeup and that sort of thing. So it was thought that he looked better, more relaxed, and so on. Now, granted, there was no random sample. There could be some other variable that attributes to how things are perceived and so on. But it is interesting to note that the only difference between those two groups was one had visual information and the other one only had audio information, but yet they perceived the same event differently. So from this point on, this idea of image is really important. And there's a couple old jokes, old adages that people like Abraham Lincoln wouldn't be able to be elected today because, well, quite frankly, he's butt ugly. Then you've got Thomas Jefferson probably couldn't be elected today because he had a speech impediment. So you have these people that are otherwise great presidents but would not be able to be elected because of rather minor factors. Another thing about the media and presidential elections, or elections in general, is polling. Again, this goes back to that concept of horse race journalism. Media loves to talk about polls, who's up, who's down, and so on. Are these polls reliable? Actually, yes, they are. Even in the fallout from the Trump-Clinton election, the polls were actually pretty accurate. Well-executed polls predicted that Hillary Clinton would receive the majority of the popular vote. They can't really say that she would win because then you'd have to do a randomized sample from each of the 50 states, and that's almost impossible because of cost constraints. But the number of votes that she received, or the percentage of vote that she received, was within the margin of error. So the polling that's done, if it's done accurately, done scientifically, and we'll talk about this when we talk about media, and we've already talked about some of it with public opinion. If it's done properly, this polling data can be incredibly reliable. So what is the impact of this polling? Well, it could actually impact the outcome instead of just measuring the potential outcome. There is some thought to think that a president who isn't doing that well could actually, bad polling numbers could actually depress turnout. People don't want to vote for a loser. It might decrease voter turnout amongst his supporters. So there's some discussion about the actual impact of polling. It's not just a measurement, it actually is impacting the thing. And then finally, the media can contribute to trust and confidence in government, or actually lack of trust and confidence in government. By the nature of the media, what they do is they report on greed, graft, corruption, scandal, and so forth. They don't typically report on, oh, the government did its job, oh, this agency is working, oh, these good things are happening, because people typically don't tune into that. So this constant barrage of negativity can contribute to an atmosphere in which trust and confidence in the government tends to be minimal. Here are some factors that impact decision-making by voters. Why do individuals vote the way that they do? Number one is going to be party identification. All of the things being equal, individuals tend to vote for a candidate who is of the same political party that they are. And when you have the long ballot, which means that you're electing everybody, from major offices such as president all the way down to county clerk, county court clerk, and so forth, it's very likely that voters don't always know specifically who they're voting for. They may not recognize the name. They may not even know the issues or the personalities or the qualifications of the candidates, but the D or the R by their name serves as a voter cue. Voters tend to vote for the party they identify with. Voter ideology, similar to party identification, but not quite the same, is that voters who are conservative tend to favor conservative candidates, and the same is true for liberals. They tend to favor liberal candidates. Religion can enter into this. Voters tend to prefer to vote for someone who shares their religious views. Voters that are more secular than religious tend to vote for individuals where religion isn't as big a factor. And then there are other demographic characteristics such as race, income, education level, and so forth that can all impact voter decision making. And then candidate characteristics can impact how voters vote. The image of the candidate, we talked a little bit about that when we talked about media, and then other demographic characteristics of the candidate as well. And then, of course, there are issues. For high-profile races, issues are relatively important. For lower-profile races, what typically dictates voter behavior is going to be name recognition and party identification. Most people cannot name their state legislator, so it is not likely that they're voting specifically for that person or against that person. What they're typically doing is voting based upon the party of the individual or voting for the name that they recognize. It's probably true that this doesn't account for voting behavior for presidential elections, but definitely for those lower profile races, it's true. Issues tend to dominate for higher profile elections. There's different models of voter behavior. The first one is rational choice that we need to look at. Voters typically tend to do a cost-benefit analysis as to decide whether they should participate in an election or not. And this is often used to explain why many people don't participate. You can think about it like this. What we ask people to do when they vote is we ask them to go to the polling location, typically after they've worked all day, on a work day, because we do it on Tuesdays. For most people, that's a work day. Then we ask them frequently to stand in a line, give up, time at the polling location may be an hour. For presidential elections, it's easy. That could be 2 hours or more. To stand in this line, to cast a ballot for an individual when we know that the outcome will not be determined by one vote. And for presidential elections, in most every state, it won't be determined by one vote at all, because those states with the winner-take-all rule are already spoken for. So most voters then look at that and they say, well, my one vote isn't going to determine the outcome, so why do I want to go do this and spend all of my time and inconvenience to engage in this behavior? And furthermore, because the United States is a two-party system, both candidates tend to be relatively similar. And while it is true with increasing polarization, there's greater differences between Democrats and Republicans. Whenever you compare American candidates to candidates in other democratic societies, you find actually less difference among our candidates. So the choice for the average voter is center-left, center-right, but I have to go stand in a line for 2 to 3 hours? I think not. Another model of voter behavior is called retrospective voting. And with retrospective voting, what the voter is doing is he's going to either punish or reward a candidate or a party based upon past performance. Some voters, whenever deciding how to vote, look at the past and punish or reward candidates and parties based upon how they perceive themselves benefiting. The opposite of this is going to be prospective voting. And a prospective voter, what he's going to do is he's going to look at what the candidate or the party promises, and then will vote according to that, with those issues in the past becoming less important. Finally, there's going to be party line voting. Some voters, whenever they are making their decisions, will vote wholly for Democrats or wholly for Republicans. And this is more in keeping what we see in other democratic societies, where you have stronger parties and greater party identification, and voters will tend to vote more along party lines there. In the United States, however, we've seen actually a decline in party line voting, where individuals are much more likely to split the ticket and vote for candidates of both parties. Finally, let's look at voter turnout in the United States versus other countries. standard knowledge or common knowledge that the United States has lower voter turnout relative to most other industrial democracies. So why does this happen? What is the reason for this? Number one is voter registration. Textbook reason why we have lower voter turnout is registration. In the United States, if you desire to vote in an election, typically you have to register, depending upon the state, 2, 3, 4 weeks in advance of that election. Now, granted, once you're registered, that registration continues until you don't vote for a number of elections or you move. But still yet, that motivation to vote on election day can be thwarted by a lack of registration. Some states have tried to ameliorate this by allowing same-day registration. Another reason why we have lower voter turnout when compared to other countries is because of the electoral system that we use. There is a correlation between the type of electoral system and the party system and the type of electoral system and voter turnout. Typically, electoral systems that are proportional in nature tend to have higher voter turnout than electoral systems that are single-member district, or we would use the term first-past-the-post in comparative politics. In a first-past-the-post electoral system, or single-member district, you tend to only have 2 major parties, whereas in a proportional representation system, you tend to have multiple parties. And the thought goes is that voters like choices. So in electoral systems that produce greater choices, you tend to have higher voter turnout, and in electoral systems that produce less choice, you tend to have lower voter turnout. Some other political systems actually have compulsory voting. For example, Australia. In Australia, if you don't vote in a national election, you pay a rather significant fine. I mean, it's not cost prohibitive, but it's definitely not something that you want to pay. If you don't vote in a lower level election, you pay a minor fine. But definitely this idea of having to pay a fine is an incentive for people to actually go out and vote. Another reason why we tend to have lower voter turnout in other countries is the day and time of election. In the United States, we have elections on a workday, Tuesday, and the polling locations tend to be open from commonly 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening, maybe 8 in the evening. And with commute times and people working 8 hours and having to pick up kids and so forth, it can actually take about 12 hours of your day. Many other industrial democracies actually will declare a national holiday and most everything will shut down for the day, and they'll do an election, which tends to drive up voter turnout. Some other democracies will do multiple day voting, which gives people more options as to when they go vote. Another reason why we have lower voter turnout is frequency of elections. We have elections all the time, whereas in most other industrial democracies, you typically only vote for a member of a local council and then have one national election, whereas in the United States, we have primaries and general elections, midterm elections, off-year elections, special elections, and each election tends to decrease the perception of importance of all elections. Whereas if you only had 1 or 2, then people might perceive that election as being more important and more likely to participate. And then finally, presidential versus parliamentary systems. There tends to be higher voter turnout in parliamentary systems and a tad lower voter turnout in presidential systems. So as the United States is a presidential system, its voter turnout will tend to be lower than parliamentary systems, all other things being equal.